There are notebooks, and then there's Traoré's notebook. Not made in Silicon Valley, no AI, no cloud sync, just ink, instinct, and the kind of ideas that make empires sweat. It looked like any other battered dog-eared journal, except it wasn't. Inside were not the usual half-baked policy drafts or Western development cliches. This was Traoré's war map, but not of bombs and tanks. It was of self-reliance, food sovereignty, resource control, ideas so dangerous, so subversive, that several world leaders reportedly developed spontaneous migraines upon hearing them read aloud. The West? Baffled. How is he doing this without our consultants? They whispered. No PR agency, no IMF roadmap, not even a Harvard Zoom call? It was heresy, and yet in those quiet pages, something radical was happening. Burkina Faso was being reimagined, not as a playground for international NGOs, but as a functioning independent state. Traoré didn't storm palaces. He stormed assumptions. He didn't sign billion-dollar trade deals. He taught farmers to own the land. He didn't attend elite summits. He listened to village elders. And the most threatening part? He made it look normal, as if not begging for aid was a basic function of leadership, as if trusting your people more than your foreign donors wasn't political suicide, but common sense. The notebook wasn't just a symbol. It was a mirror held up to a tired world order, one that asked uncomfortable questions. If he can govern with a notebook and a dream, what's everyone else's excuse? And so the silence began, not from Traoré, but from those who once claimed to speak for the global South. Because in a world drowning in PDFs and performative panels, one man with a pen was suddenly rewriting the script. Barack Obama entered the room not as a president, but as a legend. Or at least that's what his entourage would have us believe. Nobel Peace Prize laureate, architect of the Yes We Can era, and a man whose speeches once moved nations. But in this particular room, with its stark walls and the quiet hum of African resistance, legacy was not enough. He extended a hand, smiled that signature smile polished by years of global applause, and opened with pleasantries that seemed almost too carefully chosen. The subtext was clear. I'm not here to command, I'm here to guide you, gently, persuasively, diplomatically, as the West always does before it takes what it wants. Obama had come to meet Traoré not as a bulldozer, but as a velvet glove. His approach was soft, almost fatherly. He talked of partnerships, of shared democratic values, of Africa's place at the table. And with each word, he unknowingly revealed his miscalculation, thinking that Traoré, like many before him, could be coaxed into playing a Western script. But this wasn't 2009, and this wasn't a room full of agreeable diplomats. Traoré sat still, expression unreadable, like a mountain listening to the wind. No reaction to the name-dropping of Mandela. No flinch at the mention of development aid. Obama was laying bricks for a bridge that Traoré had no intention of crossing. And then, the moment came. The moment Obama said with gentle firmness, "You don't have to fight the world alone, Captain." A pause. A silence so thick it swallowed the room. And Traoré, without theatrics, without anger, simply replied, "But your world is not mine." Boom. That was it. No grand speech. Just a fault line drawn in one sentence. It was the kind of line that doesn't just end conversations, it ends assumptions. Obama leaned back slightly, blinked, recalibrated, as if realizing too late that he wasn't in control of the tempo. The music had changed, and Traoré was the conductor now. In diplomacy, silence is rarely empty. It is usually a message, calculated, curated, and painfully pregnant with meaning. But the silence that followed Traoré's quiet rebuke, "But your world is not mine," was something else entirely. It wasn't the silence of hesitation. It wasn't the silence of negotiation. It was the sound of an empire realizing it no longer had the floor. The cameras kept rolling, not because they were supposed to, but because no one dared to blink. Somewhere behind Obama's polished exterior, a flicker of disbelief passed. Not quite visible, but definitely there. This wasn't part of the script. Traoré was meant to nod thoughtfully, perhaps push back gently, but ultimately concede. That's how it always worked. But this time, the silence didn't belong to Obama. It belonged to Traoré, and the world heard it. In Paris, a foreign policy analyst dropped his pen mid-commentary. In London, headlines were already drafting themselves. Traoré defies the West, a new era begins. And in Washington, aides exchanged glances filled with something dangerously close to admiration. Or was it fear? The silence spread like a fault line, cracking the smooth surface of Western confidence. The man who once ordered drone strikes with a Nobel on his shelf had just been strategically disarmed, not by force, not by outrage, but by a man who refused to be impressed. And let's not pretend this didn't sting. After all, Barack Obama was used to shaping narratives, bending history with rhythm and cadence. But Traoré offered no rhythm, no dance, no verbal duel. He simply withheld his participation in the theater. And that was unforgivable, because for the first time in a very long time, the West wasn't met with applause or even anger. It was met with indifference, a rejection so calm, so quiet, it echoed louder than any protest. It said, "We are not moved. We are not afraid. We are not for sale." In that silence, Traoré didn't just reject Obama's offer. He rejected the system that made the offer possible, and the West finally started to listen. The West panic button, media, think tanks, and the new threat. As the footage of Traoré's one-sentence thunderbolt ricocheted across the digital world, panic settled like fog over Western capitals. In Washington, a State Department aide whispered, "We've got a problem." In London, a Foreign Office strategist asked, "Where the hell is Ouagadougou again?" And in Paris, oh Paris, an entire team at the Élysée scrambled to draft a new colonialism-flavored press release, now with 30% more humanitarian concern. But the panic wasn't just bureaucratic, it was spiritual, because Traoré hadn't just defied an offer, he'd defied an entire worldview. Within hours, the mainstream Western media switched into overdrive. CNN ran a segment titled, "Traoré, Rising Star or Rising Threat." Sky News went with, "Burkina Faso's strongman, the new Gaddafi," and The Economist, ever the poetic empire builder, graced us with "The African Mirage, Traoré in the Illusion of Sovereignty." No one dared ask, what is he actually doing? The question was irrelevant. His crime wasn't policy, it was posture. He stood up. Think tanks, those vast production lines of elegant condescension, suddenly bloomed like mushrooms after rain. Reports poured out like declarations of war. The Sahel power vacuum and the need for Western stabilization. Traoré's military populism, a threat to democratic norms. Decolonizing delusion when anti-imperialism goes too far. Of course, these papers were written in Washington, Geneva, and Brussels, far from the Sahel heat and even further from the realities they claimed to interpret. Their authors included experts in governance, conflict resolution, and African democratization, which usually meant someone who once spent a summer in Nairobi and reads the New York Times with a French press in hand. Meanwhile, Western editorial pages lit up like alarm bells. If African leaders start rejecting us openly, what message does that send to the rest of the continent? What happens when resource-rich countries realize they can survive without our IMF handcuffs? Who will organize their elections, teach them transparency, and monitor their human rights on our terms? But it wasn't just journalists and think tanks. The security apparatus quietly mobilized. Leaked cables described Traoré as increasingly unmanageable and politically disruptive. Translation? He doesn't take our calls. Internal memos suggested deploying soft power countermeasures. Amplify civil society voices who promote democratic values. Highlight concerns about press freedom in Traoré's government. Fund youth programs that preach global cooperation, with carefully selected partners, of course. It's not war, it's PR with air cover. Meanwhile, in high-level cocktail parties from DC to Davos, The tone was somewhere between bewilderment and fury. One former ambassador allegedly said, "The man has no respect for traditional diplomacy." Yes, that's the point. Traoré, unlike many before him, wasn't asking for a seat at the table. He was flipping the table, asking why the chefs were all from NATO, and the meal always came with austerity sauce. And that is what frightened them. Because if Traoré succeeds, others will ask, what if sovereignty is more than a flag and an anthem? What if development doesn't need permission? What if leadership means confronting power, not begging it? In a system that relies on managed dissent, controlled opposition, and the occasional symbolic resistance, Traoré broke the rules by playing for real. His speeches weren't filtered through Western advisors. His reforms didn't pass through approval by donor boards. His loyalty seemed to lie, not with think tanks nor with ambassadors, but with his people. And so, as headlines vilified him, as experts denounced him, and as institutions scrambled to contain him, one truth became uncomfortably clear. The West doesn't fear what Traoré might do. They fear that others might follow him. While Western headlines painted Traoré as a militant populist or Putin's puppet in the Sahel, they conveniently ignored the most inconvenient fact of all. He had a plan, not a tweet, not a photo op, a plan. And worse, for the old order, it wasn't written in Paris, polished in Washington, or approved in Brussels. Traoré's vision wasn't about isolation, it was about liberation. Not the bombastic version where flags fly and statues fall, though he certainly didn't mind toppling a few marble generals, but a more subversive kind. Economic autonomy, military self-reliance, and ideological independence. It started with a blunt, almost impolite question. Why must African economies be built on exporting what they don't control to people they didn't elect, under contracts they didn't write? Suddenly, the empire's rules started to look less like international cooperation and more like a mafia protection racket. Burkina Faso under Traoré began reviewing mining contracts, demanding fairer terms, sometimes even, how dare he, nationalizing resources. To some in the West, this wasn't governance. It was heresy. He called for Pan-African military coordination, not as a decorative gesture, but as an actual defense mechanism, untied from French logistics or American drones. One Western analyst whispered that could create a parallel security bloc outside NATO oversight. Yes, that was the idea. Then came the push for currency independence, a direct threat to the CFA franc, the colonial coin still wrapped in the French treasury's warm paternal grip. Traoré proposed something unimaginable. Let us print our own money, control our reserves, and trade with each other. The reaction from Paris was somewhere between diplomatic seizure and financial exorcism. Because if Africans no longer begged for euros, what would happen to all those financial institutions built on dependency? Even education wasn't safe. Traoré commissioned a curriculum overhaul, removing colonial history as the dominant narrative and replacing it with African perspectives, languages, and science adapted to regional realities. To many in the West, this sounded like a rejection of global values. To Africans, it sounded like finally getting their voice back. But perhaps the most subversive part of Traoré's vision was his rejection of victimhood. He didn't beg for aid. He didn't cry at UN podiums. He didn't appeal to guilt. Instead, he looked directly into the camera and said, essentially, "We don't need your permission to build. We only needed to remember we could." That terrified the architects of the old empire, because their dominion was never just about guns or gold. It was about psychology, about convincing an entire continent that its future could only be written in someone else's ink. Traoré refused to play the role of the grateful rebel. He didn't ask to reform the system. He asked, why must we play this rigged game at all? In private conferences, Western diplomats asked one another, but if Africa becomes autonomous, what do we offer them? The silence that followed was deafening, not because they lacked ideas, oh, the West always has ideas, but because for the first time Africa might not need them. And this, more than sanctions, more than media spin, more than embassy warnings, this is what keeps empire builders awake at night. That someone, somewhere, stopped asking, "Can we be free?" and instead said, "We already are." Traoré's vision isn't about Burkina Faso alone. It's about a new blueprint, a dangerous one where Africa doesn't wait to be invited to the table. It builds its own. And perhaps worse, others might want to sit there. As the video went viral and was translated into multiple languages, Ibrahim Traoré's influence transcended the borders of Burkina Faso. This was no longer just a national story. It became a symbol of a new wave of leadership, one grounded in humility and genuine partnership with the people. International organizations began to shift their perspective on development. It was no longer about mere aid, but about respecting local identities and empowering communities as equal partners. At prestigious universities like Harvard, Oxford, and Nairobi, Traoré's approach started being taught as a case study on social innovation and sustainable development. Conferences and panel discussions on the Burkina Faso model attracted scholars, students, and activists worldwide. Burkina Faso was no longer seen as a fragile or dependent nation, but as a source of inspiration for real, transformative change. Back home, the transformation became more visible than ever. Villages stopped waiting for external assistance and began organizing community councils to plan and implement development projects together. Women's groups formed solar energy cooperatives that not only generated power, but also educated neighboring communities on renewable energy. Stories of self-reliance and creativity spread rapidly, igniting unprecedented pride and unity. As for Ibrahim Traoré himself, he remained humble and grounded, quietly walking among the people, listening to every voice no matter how small. He didn't seek the spotlight or grand speeches because, for him, true power came from the connection and trust between leaders and the people they serve. This movement was more than actions or words. It was a spirit, a reminder that sustainable development begins with people, with humility, and with mutual respect. And this spirit is slowly reshaping how the world views leadership and development, sparking a wave stronger than ever before. The quiet revolution sparked by Ibrahim Traoré's vision was no longer confined to Burkina Faso's borders. It spread like wildfire through the continent and beyond, capturing hearts and minds of those hungry for change. Across Africa, youth organizations, local entrepreneurs, and community leaders began adopting the principles Traoré championed. Listening first, respecting local knowledge, and building solutions from the ground up. In the town of Kaya, for example, women formed a solar collective called Sol Desmi. They weren't just distributing solar lights, they were teaching energy literacy, empowering entire communities to manage their own resources. Their motto, "We don't wait for help, we create hope," became a rallying cry across villages and cities alike. When asked about their inspiration, one elder smiled warmly. "Our son, the one in the red beret." International observers started to pay close attention. Several major NGOs shifted strategies, moving away from traditional top-down aid toward genuine co-development partnerships that respected the autonomy and culture of African communities. A spokesperson from the United Nations summed it up. "This is no longer about helping Africa, it's about standing alongside it." Meanwhile, Traoré continued his humble daily routine, walking through villages, drinking tea with farmers and mechanics, listening more than speaking. When a journalist asked how he felt about becoming a global icon, he calmly replied, "I don't want to be remembered. I want our people to remember who they are." In Washington, Barack Obama finally made a public statement. It was brief but heartfelt. "President Traoré's vision challenged me. His people's courage inspired me. His invitation remains open. I intend to visit." Back in Ouagadougou, spontaneous celebrations erupted, not because of the upcoming visit, but because the world had finally seen what the people of Burkina Faso had always known. Dignity, when nurtured and protected, becomes true power. And their president had given them back their voice. As the sun set behind the rooftops of Ouagadougou, a new chapter quietly began. Ibrahim Traoré, though now recognized globally, remained deeply rooted in his people. He did not seek applause or headlines. His mission was clear: to build a future shaped by those who lived it every day. At a national forum held just weeks later, organized not by politicians but by students and young farmers, Traoré sat among them, not above. He listened intently, took notes, asked questions. When a young woman voiced, "We don't want speeches, we want tools," Traoré smiled and replied, "Then let's build the factory together." The room erupted in applause, not for promises made, but for the proof of solidarity. Internationally, leaders watched closely. Some admired silently, others reached out cautiously. But the message was undeniable. Leadership rooted in humility and presence had taken hold. Obama prepared for his quiet visit, not as a statesman seeking headlines, but as a student eager to learn. Back home, life moved forward. Traoré's daily routine of walking through villages, sharing tea and engaging with farmers, mechanics, and artisans continued. His leadership was a living example, not of power wielded from afar, but of strength born in community. The ripple that began with a single video had become a wave reshaping global conversations on development, leadership, and dignity. Burkina Faso was no longer a fragile state dependent on aid. It had become a mirror reflecting a new Africa, honest, resilient, and proudly self-reliant. And in that quiet transformation lay the true power. A people remembering who they were, a leader walking beside them, and a world beginning to listen. If you believe in the power of true leadership, leadership rooted in humility, courage, and the voice of the people, then join us in this journey. Like this video to show your support for President Ibrahim Traoré and the new vision for Africa. Share this story with those who need to hear it so the ripple becomes a wave. Subscribe now, not just for more stories, but to be part of a movement that honors dignity, resilience, and hope. Together, we are more than viewers. We are the new voice of a continent reclaiming its future. Because change begins when we listen, and it grows when we act. Thank you for standing with us. The future is waiting, and it belongs to all of us.